So what I've assembled is really an excellent panel of from right to left. So we have Dewey Johnson, who is the senior vice president. He basically runs chemical market analytics, which you know is one of the leading companies doing analyses on different chemicals, et cetera, around the world. And he has his annual World Chemical Forum, which I had the privilege of speaking at. I didn't kill any in the audience, right? Dewey, right? All right. And then we have Charlie Abess, who is with Rhodium. Rhodium is one of the real pioneers and one of the, in terms of analysis they do, and in particular related to China. And I know a number of folks at Rhodium. Charlie is part of the group that really they have unbelievable expertise about China. What they're particularly known for is developing their own independent analysis and data, as opposed to relying on, well, the one thing you definitely don't want to do is rely on Chinese government data, but what's really going on in terms of the Chinese economy and exports and what's going on. And last, Ms. Huang, who is a professor at Columbia University, and she is the head of the Weatherhead Institute, and her area of expertise covers a whole bunch of the countries down in that part of the world, Vietnam, and et cetera, et cetera. So she'll bring the perspective from her side on what's happening there. And why is this important? Because whether it's Dewey understanding globally, but also the Middle East, or Charlie on China, and Professor Nguyen on Southeast Asia and Vietnam, that's where a lot of stuff is happening, right? And it's going to affect all of us. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this as a fireside chat, and then what I'll do is some questions I'll direct to one particular individual, but others I will just let anyone who wants to comment. And I want to start out because China is an important topic, and maybe Charlie, if you could start out and just say, what do you think is going on in China economically and politically? There's a huge debate about whether the Chinese economy is going to really decline or not. They're certainly struggling to meet their goal of 5% growth for this year. What do you think is going on? And obviously, the political part is also an important part of the equation as well.
Thank you, Peter. And it's a delight to be here, a real honor to be with this esteemed panel and to be with you today. Just sort of a word of context, in Rhodium, we do independent analysis on China. About half of our company does China research, half of our company does work on energy and climate. We do work with some chemical companies, but we're not at all chemicals experts. So I hope you'll bear with me if I say anything that's blatantly false. So what's happening in the Chinese economy? Well, everybody knows that, anecdotally anyway, the Chinese economy is struggling considerably. Currently, headline data that came out for Q3 says that the Chinese economy grew about 4.6%. Our view is that it's much lower. We base that view by looking at the expenditure side of GDP. So looking at how households are doing, how business investment is going, net exports, and government spending. And so just a few thoughts on those things. On the consumption side, retail growth so far this year to date, it's been about 3.5%, which is remarkably low, much lower than we've seen in previous years. That's deriving from systemically weak employment and wage growth. That's well recognized, and there's been a topic of reform plans that we discussed in June, much farther back. But there hasn't been a systemic way to tackle that problem in any meaningful regard. So household consumption is widely regarded as very weak. Investment is the traditionally big story, right? That we measure this by looking at bank lending, how much money is flowing out of banks into the economy. Since that's just a better, more objective way of looking at actually how money flows are going to follow money. And if you look at bank lending right now, annualized, we are at record lows, about 5.5% growth in bank lending after you take out the rolled over debt that's going into local governments just to refinance debt. And that's at really near record lows. And that change importantly is structural. You know, as Joseph mentioned earlier, China underwent a massive expansion of its banking system after the global financial crisis. And that's what fueled a lot of the growth that took place in the property sector and infrastructure. And the banking sector simply cannot expand at the rate of growth that it once did to provide that sort of level of debt-driven growth. The banking sector is financed by retained earnings that come through, and there's so much debt now that's in the system where new banking loans that are going out are simply to refinance and roll over this old debt, making monetary policy, frankly, a less useful tool for Chinese policymakers as they try to stimulate the economy. And that's exactly what we're seeing so far this year, with failure for stimulus to really drive growth. Third is on government spending. And this has been a shockingly poor print this year. Government spending is going to be a drag on growth this year. You know, China's local governments in particular are enormously fiscally constrained. And China's tax base derives from a lot of the sectors that have seen the most contraction, particularly the property sector. And the new sources of growth in services are not well taxed, and to tax them would put a tax on consumers in a way that China's government is less willing to do. And so, you know, China's fiscal system is now much more constrained than I think is widely recognized. It's something that the IMF is just beginning to sort of discuss seriously. But the Chinese side, particularly the discussion about stimulus and the third plenum sort of reform plan that came out in June, it's not been an area of focus, and it needs to be. So what does that leave the Chinese economy to do? Well, you have net exports, and that's been like the silver lining for growth this year. The trade surplus through October year on year is up 16%. And a lot of that is driven by systemic weakness in domestic consumption that is now going into international markets. This is exactly also because, you know, in China's economy, particularly as the state sector has expanded, it's very difficult to convince companies to downsize. A lot of SOEs and folks in sort of priority sectors like EVs really face very little incentive to let unprofitable ventures die. And in fact, there's a perverse incentive to continue expanding growth during cycles of overcapacity, because when eventually the government does get around to try and get in its hands around the industry, it wants to let the strong survive and the weak die. And that's measured often by the amount of assets you have under your control. And so this weak domestic Chinese demand, surging export growth, is driving trade defense measures across the world. We're seeing this in Europe now, with the EU having decided to place definitive duties on electric vehicles coming from China, for some automakers to the tune of like 35%. We're going to be seeing it in the United States for sure. We're seeing it in Brazil. We're seeing it in India. And so tariffs from Trump are certainly coming, but it's not only going to be a Trump story. Overcapacity, certainly a feature of the discussions we've had so far in the chemical sector, but it's not solely here. So I'll stop there for first remarks about how Chinese economy is doing.
Yeah, no, that's very, very helpful. I do have one question, actually. So, I mean, one observation, which is the Chinese, in some ways, tried to adopt the Japanese strategy early in the 60s, when the Japanese said, okay, we're going to create a whole lot of competitors in the sector and then gradually weed them out, but then support, country champions, so forth. And it worked in partially. The problem with the Chinese is they don't have a system for weeding them out, right? So what they do is they create all these people, it's competitive, but they don't have a system, they don't have a bankruptcy system like they do in a lot of countries. So you're stuck with too many companies. The sad part about the electric vehicle thing is virtually every Chinese electric vehicle company is losing money. Virtually every one. So if you say, oh, are they competitive because they're creating good products? Yes, there's no question that they're creating some good electric vehicles. But a huge part of this is the willingness and the encouragement to price low and lose money. And that's a big dilemma. One question, there were a whole bunch of announcements recently, and the one just a few days ago about a huge amount to help the local governments refinance. my personal opinion, it doesn't solve the problem, it just changes how much debt, or whatever, I mean, what's your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't even really do that. I mean, so a number of stimulus measures have been announced in recent months. Some related to subsidies for trading in household appliances and old cars for new ones. Some that have related to lowering the cost of mortgages. Some that have just been, reducing lending rates. But one of the big ones that's been discussed, because local government debt is such a challenge, is how to help local governments who are where the rubber meets the road on the local government spending, in the aggregate, like how to make them spend more. And to put some context here, the Chinese government officially says that there's about 14 trillion yuan worth of debt out there in the system. Once you account for the local government finance vehicles that are implicitly government debt, that number rises to about 50-60 trillion yuan. The announcements that came out last week from the Ministry of Finance announced that they will be providing debt swaps to the tune of about 2 trillion yuan per year for like the next 10 years. That's not even handing over like local to central government. It's just allowing local governments to refinance expensive debt that they paid for out through wealth management products to like base rates that's being provided by the People's Bank of China. So yeah, there's nowhere near what's necessary to tackle the local challenge.
This is a perfect segue to the Lianhong Yuan Hu, because a lot of the world said, okay, if we don't depend much on China, and if labor rates are going up, why don't we pivot to Vietnam, Cambodia, and so forth? So I'd like her to comment about that. But I do want to make one comment to what Charlie said, and that is, you don't always wish your enemy to fail, because the problem with China, if you like to call China the enemy, is if they fail, it's a serious problem for the rest of the world, right? And because then there's all sorts of, if you thought the flood of cheap Chinese products we've had now, it would just get worse if in fact they continue to have these kinds of problems. So, it is a case where you don't want them to fail, but the other problem, of course, is the government's policy with regard to their political needs, with regard to controlling the population, however, goes counter to what is needed by the entrepreneurs and so forth. They're creating an environment where no one wants to start companies where they feel that all of the subsidies are going to the state-owned enterprises, which is such a huge clash, which is just making the problem worse. So tell us now, everything's really great in places like Vietnam and so forth, right? So maybe if you can comment on how this pivot has happened and what's going on in those countries that we follow.
So thank you for having me here today. I just got out of a teaching class this morning, and so I'm doing this mental switch to now really going outside my comfort zone. But I have to say, I really enjoy.
Just pretend these are your students.
They're my yes,
They're
my students plus 20 years. But yes, no. So one of the things that makes it very exciting to teach modern Southeast Asia, so really modern Southeast Asian history to the present, is its diversity. But one of the things that I'm seeing in applying this to the role that the sort of chemical industry will play in Southeast Asia is actually hampered by its diversity and by some of the challenges and handicaps that I would have seen as a historian as its strengths. And what I'll say about this is that it's clear in my capacity as the director of the Institute and someone who's founding Southeast Asian Studies is that the chemical industry, articulated by the leaders of these 10 nations, about 5 have really professed that it will be the sort of the economic pillar of industrialization, urbanization, and consumer demand, meaning the chemical industry will be huge in Southeast Asia. And while Peter told me to not do rah rah rah, be a cheerleader for Southeast Asia,
No, you can.
I can. Okay, that again, you're listening to a poor professor. If I had money, I would bet on chemicals for Southeast Asia. And this is because the governments of at least 5 of the leading countries have really put put action behind words, put resources behind policy. And in that sense, in addition to why I see Southeast Asia as being, sort of, strategically poised to take advantage, of the chemical industry in particular, is because of its human labor. So you have young workforce, increasing urbanization, growing middle class, that's basically with heightened demand for the products made by chemicals, and of course the geostrategic location, which I've long thought about. This is really, its access to the Indian Pacific Oceans. If it just reaches out to the Middle East, it'll benefit from basically anything that goes downstream from China. So in many ways, again, it's human capital, as well as its geostrategic location makes it really, the region in particular poised to take advantage of the situation moving forward. Of the 10 countries in Southeast Asia, again, I talked about the differences. We could just discount Myanmar. We can discount Brunei. We could probably also discount, unfortunately, Cambodia and Laos and the Philippines. And so I want to focus particularly on Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand as the 5 leading countries in the region with regard to the chemical industry. And again, what I really want to just emphasize is that the governments, states are behind this pivot or this turn to the chemical industry, or its heightened importance in its continuing industrialization efforts. Vietnam, of course, has talked about its new, what's called its 2030, 2040 vision, which is all about basically committing to, here I have notes because again, this is outside of my area of expertise, even though I was just there last week and did not get to talk to anyone about the chemical industry, but I know that they are basically aiming to achieve about 9 to 11% annual growth in green chemicals, as we just discussed. And then of course, Singapore as a high income nation, city-state, has already, and I think we've seen the sort of commitment behind the Sustainable Jurong Island vision. So both of these countries, again, are talking about how important, the sort of chemical industry will be for their country's continued development. At the same time, again, I will just flag into Malaysia and Thailand, because what I see in those 2 countries is this investment in the circular economic equation. So the sort of ability to recycle technologies. And again, they put resources behind this. They made about statements that this is something that basically that the countries are committed to. And then finally, Indonesia is purported to want to sustain basically independence and less reliance on imported petrochemicals. So again, putting teeth behind but really again committing to making the chemical industry and these major changes to their economy in terms of this sphere. I would say the drivers, and again, I'll just mention these, and we can talk about them more in Q&A, is of course, first is sustainability. Again, that's an asset for Southeast Asia because the government's behind it. Economic and geopolitical influences, again, they benefited as a result of the pandemic and changes in the supply chain, as well as basically US-China trade wars. So Southeast Asia, again, we'll see if they will continue to benefit. They will also, of course, be hurting from the Trump's about 10 to 20% tariffs on all imports, but again, we'll see how Southeast Asia manages that. And then the third, I think, driver that really benefits or puts Southeast Asia at an advantage is that that basically it is, there's mine, the technological advancements and digitalization. Again, AI, I caught the tail end of the discussion going on here, so we'll just have to see how that plays out. But again, the governments are behind playing in this new, sort of technological sphere, that they want to be producing semiconductors, that they're putting potentially more resources towards R&D. So, and all of it, I think, makes Southeast Asia an interesting region to follow. And again, because I don't want to end on a sort of being a cheerleader, is that there are lots of disadvantages to the region if you're looking at it as a whole. Again, I think ASEAN in particular as sort of regional structure could help because it could sort of make the region much more attractive in terms of, you know, sort of a unified market, production based, regulatory frameworks, harmonizing tariffs. Can only work if the member states all go, you know, sort of fall in line, but they don't. They run the gamut in terms of the different political systems at play. You have a military dictatorship, which we see in Myanmar, which is not part of ASEAN, but then you also have a communist country that is not a market economy, which that's Vietnam, it so wants to be. And then you also have differences in terms of where they fall vis-a-vis China. All of these reasons or factors make it so that it cannot act as a unified bloc. And we saw that most recently in the latest ASEAN summit hosted in Vientiane. They could not figure out what to do about Myanmar. They could not figure out what to do about the South China Sea.
Well, by the way, I always like giving a professor a difficult time. Right? And I told her, I apologize. I said, you know, asking you to comment on all Southeast Asia is really an unfair assignment because there is so much diversity within that region. You know, I mean, comparing Indonesia to Vietnam and so forth. But it's important to comment because overall, it is a part of the world that's going to achieve much greater growth than, you know, most of the Western. But the picture country by country can be very different, whether they have oil or they don't have oil, if they have a big population or not big population. But you really have to talk about Southeast Asia because it's going to be an important place for overall growth. What each of your strategies might be quite different by country, right? You know, what you do in Singapore, or Indonesia, or whatever, can be quite different. So, you know, I give you an A for my difficult question, but I do think I encourage all of you to really pay a lot of attention to that part of the world because it's going to be an important part. The only sad thing about some is that they're not that big. You know, I mean, if Vietnam was a much bigger country, there would be a bigger opportunity for Vietnam, but also for people investing in Vietnam because it's only, you know, because of size. Now we're going to pivot to Dewey, and I'm going to be even more unreasonable for Dewey because we have to have someone. It's obvious Dewey's going to be able to talk about the Middle East, but I'm also going to ask him to come about India. You know, and that way we'll cover all of, you know, that part of the world. And really, if you could comment on what you think is going on in terms of particularly as it folks to the things that relate to the chemical industry. And by the way, I have so many friends who are from India, and it's a sad case where, you know, if they could get all the things going right, you know, they could really boom. But it always seems like one tire is flat, right? So they got a big engine, they got three tires that are great and one's flat. They can't go more than 20 miles an hour, even though they got a big engine. So my hope is sometime India will get all four tires, you know, inflated and they can move ahead.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you. It's great to be here and great to talk about the chemical industry and one of our favorite topics for CMA. So India is ever since I've been in the industry, which has been many years, it's always been the next China and hasn't arrived. So when we look at growth for the last 5 years at least, and maybe the last 10, it's been all about China. By the way, 80% of the demands globally in chemicals have been China. And so our view going forward is that growth is still going to be there at a multiple of GDP for chemical demand, but it's going to be more distributed around the world. And the poster child that's going to be really the star is India. India characterized to grow at 7% per year for the next 10 years or so. And by the way, we're talking about Southeast Asia. Many of the major players there are clients of ours, Petronas and Thai Oil and Thai Chemicals and Indorama, great companies. And you know, we see Southeast Asia population growth is positive. middle class is continuing to grow. And so we see growth in Southeast Asia for sure in chemicals. Petronas certainly does. I was with the CEO of the corporate, head of corporate strategy there. Clearly, they're looking at how to position for demand growth in Southeast Asia, as well as the Thai companies. Indonesia certainly a positive market as well. India, critical issue. We see a number of state-owned oil companies seeking to expand chemicals. Many of those major players are clients of ours. Reliance has been a client for decades with us. And Reliance, of course, the largest player in India. We're seeing a number of Indian Oil, a number of the other state oil companies moving into chemicals. But, and I'll show a chart a little bit later, while India demand is continuing to grow, India will not be able to build to keep up with the demand that's happening in India. And one of the majors, the last expansion, this was about 5 years ago, to put together the financial package, it was like over 50 banks were together to part of that finance project. So the complication of not only getting approval to build, but the financial wrap that has to occur to make the investment in India is just really challenging. So good demand growth. It will continue to be even more, I call it polarization of even more of a significant importer, a great demand sink. And if you are a low cost advantage feedstock provider, like the Middle East, like the US, it's a great place to partner with. So there's a big demand sink. Middle East has huge advantage because politically that they're not the best of friends. But again, that's a natural partnership, especially with Saudi's announcement of big investments in moving more and more of oil to chem. So again, we continue to engage with clients that are looking to invest in chemicals. We find them on always a slow rhythm. There's plans, they plan to do it, but it just takes much longer than a Western company or Chinese company. Middle East typically takes longer, but they build it. And India will just, the good thing is demand will continue to grow. It'll grow, they will continue to import more and more.
Middle East, you there?
Yeah, so the Middle East is a great story in terms of, well, let me neutralize that. The Middle East is going to add a lot of capacity. Their advantage feedstock. So as you may remember earlier this year, the Saudis announced a liquid to chemicals program. They've since retrenched on that. But the original announcement was they were going to move 4 million barrels a day of crude into chemicals. That's a huge volume. That's depending on the amount of how much refined product is actually moved to chemicals on the technology. That's anywhere from 100 to 200 million tons of chemicals. That's on a global chemical capacity of say 900 million tons. So that would transform and restructure the industry. So given the slowing down of energy transition, the Saudis have announced that they are not going to build, for example, one of the large plants they expected to build in Saudi Arabia. But as Peter mentioned earlier, they have relationships in China, both with the Sinopec, but also with Rongsheng and other state-owned companies in China. They have relationships in South Korea. So they're looking now to create partnerships where the demand is, especially in China, and then either in equity relationships, primarily through equity relationships, then move that oil and feedstocks with their partners to support their demand. Therefore, having less retaliation or pushback when they add significant capacity. We do see. I mentioned Saudi because that's kind of the largest, but Qatar is adding capacity. They have announced they're moving forward with a large cracker and polyolefins plant in both in Qatar and one with CP Chem here in the US. Kuwait has a program to invest in chemicals as well. We're with Oman here in 2 weeks. Oman is building capacity, so you can go down the list of the major economies in the Middle East, and they recognize we have advanced feedstock, chemicals is growing, oil demand will plateau. Well, let's say fuels demand will plateau. We'll talk about oil demand here shortly, and it's one of the financial engines for the country. Just to mention Saudi Arabia, by the way, they do have a very diversified program, rich in minerals, and so we see them, in many other sectors as well as chemicals. But for chemicals, the Middle East is going to be a big investor, and it'll come in an advantage position.
Yeah, that's why when you talk about these big expansions, there's more industrial logic to the Middle East guys than the Chinese, because at least the Middle East, they have low cost oil and so forth. But they also are motivated one other thing, which you haven't mentioned, which is they're trying to diversify their revenues and they look around and they say, gee, of all the things, if you're mainly oil, et cetera, what do you diversify into that you feel comfortable? And obviously, one of the things they feel comfortable with is chemicals, and that's part of the logic. It's not just driven because, well, there's growth and we're low cost, we have low cost oil and so forth. It's how do we diversify? The extreme is the ADNOCs of the world who are just saying, I just want to own stuff outside of my region, and I'm comfortable with chemicals, so going after, Covestro and so forth. And that's a totally different story. I think it's very limited. You're not going to find 5 Middle Eastern players all buying up Western. So people say, is that a big trend? It's a trend of time, sort of, right? SABIC did that for a while, and now, right? But not. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting. But this just gives you a flavor of how complicated the whole story is, right? If you listen to what the panelists have to say, I don't think there's ever been any period where the issues that are geopolitical, economic, industrial, chemicals are so complicated and intertwined, right? You pull one piece over here and something else moves elsewhere. So it's going to put a great premium, which is why the speakers and topics that we picked for this time are really focused on that, right? Because we're trying to say, those of you who are CEOs, presidents of companies, you're having a harder time figuring out how to plan and how to develop your strategies, right? So we're trying, to help in that respect.